Elke told me to stay off Route 191 and take the frontage road south. She said it twice, once in English and once in German, which she only did when she meant something completely. And because the highway looked empty and the frontage road was gravel, and my rental sedan was already making a sound from underneath like a dog dragging a chain, I took the highway anyway. That was September 14th, around 3 in the afternoon, somewhere between West Yellowstone and the Idaho border. The sky was enormous and pale blue, and the road was dry, and I could see maybe 15 kilometers in every direction, and there was nothing moving anywhere except the heat shimmer lifting off the asphalt and one hawk circling above the sage flats to the east. Elke was sitting in the passenger seat with her knees drawn up and a gas station map of Montana unfolded across her shins. She had stopped arguing with me about the route maybe 40 seconds before, which was unusual because she generally argued until her point either won or became irrelevant. Her silence should have told me something. 3 kilometers later, the highway crested a low rise, and we could see the roadblock. 2 Montana highway patrol vehicles parked nose to nose across both lanes, light bars flashing, and behind them, a loose scatter of civilian cars and pickups pulled over onto the shoulder, some with doors open, some with people standing outside them looking south down the road at something I could not yet see. Elke folded the map. She did not say anything. She did not need to. That was the moment the trip became something else, although it had been becoming something else for 2 days already, and I had been finding reasons not to recognize it. My name is Lucas Cherney. At the time I was 31 years old, from Brno in the Czech Republic, and I had been in the United States for 9 days, on a holiday I had planned for 2 years. Elke Riedel was 29, from Graz, and I had known her for exactly 5 of those 9 days, which meant I had known her for all of the days that mattered, and none of the ones before. The trip was supposed to be simple. Fly into Salt Lake City, rent a car, drive north through the Tetons and Yellowstone, loop west through Montana, come back down through Idaho, return the car, fly home. A big American loop through big American landscape. Growing up in Brno, I had seen American westerns on television and read magazine articles about the national parks, and I wanted to see it with my own eyes, the scale of it, the emptiness. In the Czech Republic, you cannot drive for 3 hours without crossing a border or passing through a city. In Wyoming, you can drive for 3 hours and see nothing but grass and sky and fence posts, and the road itself shrinking to a point ahead of you. My work at the time was freelance graphic design, mostly packaging and brand identity for small Czech companies, the kind of work you can do from a laptop in a rented room or a cafe, or the back seat of a parked car if the Wi-Fi reaches. So time was flexible. Money was less flexible, but I had saved carefully, and the exchange rate was tolerable. And I had booked the cheapest motels I could find along the route, most of them the kind with outdoor corridors and ice machines that hummed all night, and parking lots where long-haul truckers slept in their cabs. Elke I met in Jackson, Wyoming on day 4. She was sitting alone at a table outside a coffee shop on the town square with a paperback novel in German and a cup of something with too much foam. Her backpack was on the ground next to her chair, oversized, the kind you take on a trek, not a city trip. She had a small Austrian flag patch sewn onto the top flap, which is how I knew where she was from before we spoke. In Europe, you learn to read those patches. They are how backpackers declare themselves to each other without having to start a conversation. I started the conversation anyway, in English, because my German is functional but stiff, and her English turned out to be much better than my German. She was traveling alone too. She had been in the U.S. for almost 3 weeks, had started in San Francisco, taken buses and one short flight to get to Wyoming, and was planning to hitch north through Yellowstone and into Montana before flying home from Bozeman. She was a physiotherapy student in her final year, taking a gap before clinical placements, and she had the particular kind of self-assurance that comes from knowing exactly how the human body works, and being mildly impatient with people who do not. We ate dinner together that night, breakfast the next morning, and by noon she had put her backpack in the trunk of my rental car, and we had agreed to share the driving and the fuel costs as far as Bozeman. That was September 9th, 5 days before the roadblock. Those 5 days had a texture that I can reconstruct almost hour by hour, because afterward I went over them repeatedly, looking for the seams, looking for the places where the ordinary world had already started to pull apart, and I had driven past without slowing down. Day 1 together we drove through Grand Teton National Park and up into Yellowstone through the south entrance. Elka wanted to see the geysers and I wanted to see the bison, and we compromised by doing both. The park was crowded despite it being September. Families, retirees, Europeans like us with rented cars and cameras. At Old Faithful, a crowd of maybe 200 people stood in a wide semicircle, waiting for the eruption. And when it came, that white column punching up into the blue, everyone clapped like it was a performance. Elka took a photograph, and I noticed a park ranger standing off to the side, near the boardwalk railing, talking into a radio with his back to the geyser. His posture was wrong. Not casual, not bored, rigid. When the crowd began to disperse, he walked quickly toward the parking area without looking at anyone. At the time, I thought he was dealing with a bear sighting or a car accident. At the time, everything still had a normal explanation. That evening in the motel outside West Yellowstone, I connected to the Wi-Fi and scrolled through news on my phone while Elka showered. A small headline on the BBC app caught my eye. U.S. health officials monitor unusual cluster of violent incidents in southern states. The article was 6 paragraphs long and said almost nothing specific. Isolated events in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Possible contamination of a regional water supply. Investigations ongoing. No travel advisories issued. The language was so careful and so empty that it read like a press release generated by a committee whose primary goal was to avoid generating a press release. Elka came out of the bathroom toweling her hair, and I mentioned it, and she shrugged. She said Americans always had violent incidents. It was part of the scenery, like the bison. Day 2, we drove the northern loop through Yellowstone, Mammoth Hot Springs, Tower Falls, the Lamar Valley. Bison everywhere. Elk on the hillsides. Ravens on the fence posts along the road. Near Tower Junction, we passed an ambulance going the other way. Fast. No siren, but lights on. And behind it, a Park Service SUV with 2 rangers in the front seats and a third in the back, who was holding a piece of cloth or gauze to his forearm. Elka watched them pass in the side mirror. She said the ranger in the back had been bleeding through the gauze. She said that very specifically. Through, not onto. I drove on. In Gardner, at the north entrance, we stopped for gas and sandwiches. The woman behind the counter at the gas station was watching a small television mounted on the wall above the cigarette display. Local Montana news. A reporter standing outside a hospital in Billings was explaining that emergency departments across the state were experiencing what she called an unusual volume of bite-related injuries. The anchor asked if this was connected to a wildlife issue, and the reporter said officials had not yet characterized the source. The woman behind the counter looked at us and said, "Used to be you only worried about grizzlies." She rang up our sandwiches and we left. Day 3, September 12th. Elka and I planned to drive from Gardner to Bozeman, which should have taken 2 hours. On the highway outside Livingston, we hit a traffic backup. Not a roadblock, just density. Vehicles stacking up for maybe a mile. When we finally crept through, the cause was a rest stop that had been cordoned off with orange cones and yellow caution tape. 2 sheriff's vehicles, a fire truck, and a white van with no markings. People in the backed-up cars were taking photographs with their phones. Through the windows, I could see personnel in the parking area wearing gloves and what looked like clear face shields, the kind I associated with hospital work. Nobody was running. Nobody was shouting. But the parking area was wet, as if someone had hosed it down. And near the entrance to the restroom building, there were several large, dark stains on the concrete that the hosing had not fully removed. Elka said we should skip Bozeman and drive straight west toward Missoula. She said it calmly, looking straight ahead through the windshield. And I said Bozeman was where she needed to catch her flight. And she said she thought maybe the flight could wait. This was unusual. Elka was precise about her plans, about her schedule, about not wasting money on changed bookings. She did not explain why she wanted to change course, and I did not push her. We drove to Bozeman anyway, because the motel reservation was already paid for, and because I still believed the world was operating under its normal rules, and normal rules included honoring prepaid reservations. The motel in Bozeman was half empty. The parking lot had maybe 8 cars in a lot built for 40. The man at the front desk checked us in without small talk, and when I asked if it was always this quiet in September, he said people were canceling. He did not say why. The television in our room had local Bozeman news and then national news. And the national news had a segment about what they were calling the Southern Disturbance, which had apparently spread from the Gulf states into Tennessee and Georgia, and was being managed by the National Guard in several municipalities. The footage showed soldiers in a suburban street next to an overturned car. But the camera was far away, and the narration used phrases like precautionary deployment and public safety cordon, and none of it conveyed anything that felt like actual information. Elka sat on the edge of the bed and watched for 20 minutes without speaking. Then she opened her laptop and spent an hour reading Austrian and German news sites. When she finished, she closed the laptop and told me that the European coverage was different from the American coverage, more specific, more alarmed. She said the Austrian Foreign Ministry had issued a Level 2 travel advisory for the southeastern United States, which meant reconsider travel, and was reportedly considering upgrading it. She said there were reports on German-language forums of American airports in Atlanta and Charlotte operating on reduced schedules, and that several European airlines had suspended bookings into those cities. I asked her what she thought was happening. She was quiet for a while. Then she said she did not know what was happening, but she knew what the pattern looked like. And the pattern looked like the early hours of something governments acknowledge only after it is too large to manage. She said this in the same tone she used when she described a patient's gait irregularity in clinical terms: observational and certain. The next morning, September 13th, I tried to return the rental car at the Bozeman airport. The rental counter was closed. A handwritten sign on the desk said, "Operations suspended. Please call customer service," and listed an 800 number. I called the number from the airport lobby. It rang 19 times. Nobody answered. I called my airline, Czech Airlines partner booking through Delta, and after 12 minutes on hold, a recorded voice told me that all Delta flights from Bozeman were suspended until further notice due to regional operational adjustments. The recording played on a loop. Regional operational adjustments. The phrase meant nothing and everything. Elka was waiting for me outside the terminal, leaning against the rental car with her arms crossed. She had already called Austrian Airlines and gotten the same kind of nothing. She said we needed to drive. She said we should go west, toward Missoula, then south into Idaho, then west to Portland or Seattle, somewhere with an international airport that was still operating, somewhere far from whatever was happening in the south, and now apparently happening in Montana, too. I agreed. There was nothing else to do. We filled the gas tank at a station near the interstate, and I noticed the price had jumped since the day before, by almost $1 per gallon. The station was busy. Pickup trucks, SUVs, cars with luggage strapped to roof racks. A woman at the next pump was filling 6 red plastic gas cans in the bed of her truck, while a man in the driver's seat watched the road. Nobody was panicking. But the efficiency of their movements had a quality I recognized from news footage of evacuations in other countries, a focused urgency that operates below the surface of ordinary behavior. We drove west on I-90 toward Missoula, and for the first 40 minutes the highway was normal. Then traffic began to thicken, and then to slow, and then to stop entirely near a town called Three Forks. We sat in the car with the engine idling for half an hour while nothing moved. Elka turned on the car radio and scanned through stations. Most of them were playing music or running their standard programming. 2 stations were carrying a Montana emergency management broadcast that said residents of Gallatin County should shelter in place until further guidance is issued, and that Highway 191 south of Belgrade was closed to civilian traffic. The broadcast repeated on a 6-minute loop. After the 3rd loop, I turned it off. The traffic began to move again, slowly, and we covered another 30 kilometers before Elka pointed at the southbound lanes across the median. They were empty. Completely empty. Not light traffic, not reduced traffic. No cars at all in either southbound lane for as far as we could see, which was several kilometers. A highway with no traffic in one direction is not a highway. It is a message. Elka said we should get off the interstate. She had been studying the gas station map while we sat in traffic, and she said there was a state highway, Route 287, that ran south toward the town of Ennis, and from there a network of smaller roads that could take us west toward Idaho without using the interstate. She said the interstate was becoming a trap. She said the word in German first, Falle, and then in English, as if making sure I understood her in both languages. I did not want to get off the interstate. The interstate felt like structure, like certainty, like a system designed to take you somewhere. The smaller roads on Elka's map looked thin and unnamed, and they wound through country that was empty even by Montana standards. Long valleys between mountain ranges with no towns marked for 50 kilometers at a stretch. But the southbound lanes were still empty, and the northbound lanes were getting slower. And I could see in the distance, maybe a kilometer ahead, the flashing lights of another roadblock. So I took the next exit. Route 287 south of Three Forks ran along the Madison River through a valley that was beautiful and enormous and almost entirely without people. Low sage hills on both sides, cottonwood trees along the water, the Tobacco Root Mountains white-capped to the west. We passed a few ranch gates, a few gravel driveways leading to houses I could not see, a few cattle guards spanning the road. No other cars. The gas gauge was at 3/4. Elka was navigating from the map, calling out turns and road names and estimated distances. She was good at it. Precise, calm, confident. At a fork south of Ennis, she directed me onto a county road that climbed into the hills away from the river valley. And we drove for an hour on gravel through country that felt lunar, sage and rock and sky and nothing else. The rental sedan bounced and scraped over the washboard surface, and the sound from underneath got worse, but the car kept moving. Elka held the map steady on her knees and did not comment on the noise. Near the Idaho border, late afternoon, we came around a curve and found a pickup truck parked sideways across the road. Not a roadblock, just a truck, stopped, driver's door open, engine off. Nobody in the cab. Elka told me to stop, and I stopped about 30 meters back. We sat in the car for a full minute looking at the truck. It was a white Chevrolet, newer model, with a toolbox bolted into the bed and a bumper sticker I could not read from that distance. The door hung open and the cab light was on, which meant the battery was still live, which meant the truck had not been there long. Elka said we should go around it. The shoulder was wide enough. I edged the rental car off the gravel onto the packed dirt and grass at the road's edge, and as we passed the truck, I looked into the cab and saw blood on the steering wheel and on the bench seat, and a cell phone on the floor of the passenger side, screen still lit, showing a map application. No driver, no body, just the blood and the phone and the open door and the silence of the hills around us. We did not speak for several minutes after that. Elka folded the map and put it on the dashboard and looked out the window. The country ahead was darker, the hills higher, the road narrower. Evening was coming. We had a quarter tank of gas and no clear destination. And we were on a road that was not on any map I could read. And we had just passed a truck with blood on the steering wheel and no one inside it. I asked Elka what she wanted to do. She said she wanted to find a building with a door that locked. She said it without drama, without fear in her voice, just a clear statement of priority. A building, a door, a lock. Everything else was secondary. The building we found was a cabin, or more precisely, a hunting lodge, set back from the road at the end of a short dirt track about 12 kilometers past the abandoned truck. There was a metal gate across the track, padlocked, with a sign that said, "Private property, no trespassing," in English. Beyond the gate, the track curved through a stand of lodgepole pines, and we could see the roofline of a structure, green metal, above the trees. Elka got out and examined the padlock and the gate. She came back and said the padlock was heavy-duty, keyed, and the gate was welded steel pipe. But there was enough room between the gatepost and the nearest tree to squeeze a person through on foot. She asked if I had a flashlight. I had one on my phone. She looked at the sky, which was going gold and pink, and said we had maybe 45 minutes of light. We left the car pulled off the road behind a clump of brush, took our backpacks, and walked in through the gap beside the gate. The track was maybe 200 meters long. The lodge was bigger than I expected. A single-story log structure with a covered porch, 2 visible windows on the front face, a stone chimney, a propane tank on a concrete pad along the side wall, and a detached shed behind it that turned out to hold a generator and stacked firewood. The front door was solid wood, locked, with a deadbolt. The windows had interior shutters, closed. The whole place had the look of something maintained but not currently occupied, like a summer house closed up for the season. Elka walked the perimeter while I tried the door and the windows. Everything was locked. She came back and said there was a back door, also locked, but that one of the rear windows had a latch that was visibly not fully seated. She used a flat stone to pop the screen frame out and then worked the latch with the blade of a pocket knife she carried in her backpack. A small, Swiss-made thing with a red handle that she treated with the same unsentimental respect she applied to everything else that functioned properly. The window opened. She climbed in, and I heard her moving through the interior, and then the front door opened, and she stood there and said, "It will do." The cabin had 4 rooms. A main room with a wood stove, a couch, a table, and 4 chairs. A kitchen with a propane stove, a sink connected to a well pump, and a pantry with canned goods, rice, dried pasta, bottled water, and a row of glass jars filled with what turned out to be home-dried venison. A bedroom with a double bed, a dresser, and a gun safe bolted to the floor in the closet, locked. A bathroom with a composting toilet and a shower connected to the same well pump. The electricity came from the generator in the shed, which was diesel, and there were 2 50-gallon drums of diesel fuel stacked behind the shed under a tarp. Elka inventoried the pantry while I got the generator started. It took me 3 tries and a careful reading of the laminated instruction card zip-tied to the generator's handle before the engine caught and the lights inside the cabin flickered on. The well pump hummed. Water coughed and then flowed from the kitchen tap. The propane stove lit on the first click. For a few minutes, standing in that kitchen with the lights on and the water running, and Elka counting cans on the shelf, the world outside felt far away and manageable. Like something happening to other people in a place I had already left behind. We ate canned soup heated on the propane stove and drank water from the tap, and sat at the table with the map spread out between us. Elka had been tracking our route, and she estimated we were somewhere in the Centennial Mountains, near the Idaho border, at an elevation of about 2,000 meters, on a road that connected to nothing major in any direction for at least 60 kilometers. We were, by any practical measure, nowhere. I turned on the car radio before we had left the vehicle. The Montana emergency broadcast was still looping, but the voice had changed. It was no longer measured and bureaucratic. It was faster, less precise, and it said things the earlier broadcast had not said. It said residents should avoid contact with any person displaying erratic or aggressive physical behavior. It said hospitals in Billings, Great Falls, and Helena were operating at capacity and could not accept new patients. It said the National Guard had established checkpoints on all major highways, and that civilian movement between counties was restricted until further notice. It said, twice, that this was not a drill. Elka and I listened to this broadcast in the cabin, on a battery-powered AM/FM radio we found in a kitchen drawer, sitting at the table with our soup bowls pushed aside and the map between us. When the broadcast looped back to the beginning, Elka reached over and turned it off. She asked me what I thought erratic or aggressive physical behavior meant, and I said I did not know. And she said she thought it meant exactly what it sounded like it meant, and that the reason they were not saying it more plainly was because saying it plainly would require them to describe something they were not prepared to describe. Outside the cabin, the darkness was total. No light pollution, no moon yet. No sound except wind in the pines and, very faintly, coyotes somewhere to the south. The cabin door was locked, the shutters were closed, the generator was running, and we were alone at the end of an unmarked road in mountains we had never seen before this evening. Elka went to bed in the bedroom. I took the couch. Neither of us slept well. The next morning was September 14th. Bright, cold, perfectly still. Frost on the grass outside. Elka was up before me, standing on the porch with a cup of instant coffee, looking south toward the valley. When I came out, she handed me a cup without speaking and pointed. Down in the valley, maybe 15 kilometers away, a column of black smoke was rising from somewhere near the road we had driven in on. Not a brush fire, which in that country would spread horizontally through the sage. This was concentrated, dark, chemical-smelling even at that distance. A structure fire, or a vehicle. We decided to stay one more day. The cabin was secure, the supplies were adequate, and neither of us had any idea what was happening on the roads. Elka suggested we conserve the generator fuel and run it only for water pumping and cooking, keeping the lights off during the day and using flashlights at night. She was thinking in systems, in resource management, in the way her physiotherapy training had apparently taught her to think about the body. What do you need? What can you reduce? What is the minimum input for continued function? She approached the cabin the same way she approached a patient. Assess, prioritize, conserve. That afternoon I explored the shed more carefully and found, behind the firewood stack, a trap door set into the concrete floor. It was steel, heavy gauge, with a recessed handle and a padlock that matched the style of the one on the front gate. The lock was not engaged. The hasp was open, the padlock hanging from it unlocked, as if whoever had last used the trap door had left in a hurry or had intended to come back soon. I opened it. Below was a steep wooden staircase descending into darkness. Cold air came up, earthy and mineral, the smell of concrete and still water. I went down with my phone flashlight and found myself in a room that was roughly 5 meters by 4 meters. Walls poured concrete, ceiling reinforced with steel beams, floor poured slab. Against one wall, metal shelving units held more canned food, cases of bottled water, medical supplies in labeled plastic bins, batteries, a hand-crank radio, a chemical toilet in a curtained alcove, and a stack of folded wool blankets. Against the opposite wall, a ventilation pipe ran up through the ceiling, and next to it, a smaller pipe that I later determined was a fresh air intake with a hand-operated bellows pump. There was no electricity down there, but there were 2 battery-powered LED lanterns on the shelf, fully charged. Elke came down behind me while I was still cataloging the shelves. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked around the space methodically, the way she had looked around the cabin, assessing scale and contents and function without commentary. Then she said, "Whoever owns this place knew something was coming. Or they knew something is always coming." She picked up one of the medical bins and opened it. Bandages, antiseptic, suture kit, antibiotics in sealed foil packets, a course of broad-spectrum antiviral medication, ibuprofen, water purification tablets. The supplies were organized and labeled and recently stocked. Nothing was expired. We brought the hand-crank radio up to the cabin and sat on the porch in the afternoon sun and turned the dial slowly across the AM band. Most frequencies were empty. Static, dead air, the hollow hiss of unoccupied bandwidth. On 2 frequencies we found the Montana emergency broadcast, which had changed again overnight. The new version was stripped of detail. It said only, "Remain indoors, do not travel, do not approach unfamiliar persons, await further instructions." On a 3rd frequency, a voice I did not recognize was speaking rapidly in English, with a slight southern accent. Not a professional broadcaster, just a person talking into a microphone somewhere. The voice said that Interstate 90 was impassable between Butte and Missoula. The voice said that the National Guard had pulled back from the western Montana corridor. The voice said that the things on the road were not sick people. The voice said they were dead, and they were walking, and they would bite, and then you would become one of them. Elke turned the dial away from that frequency, and we sat in silence for a while, and the coyotes called from the valley, and the smoke column was still rising, and neither of us said anything about what we had just heard, because saying it would require acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would require acting on it, and we were not yet ready to act. On the 3rd day at the cabin, September 15th, Elke decided we needed to leave. She did not present it as a suggestion. She laid the map on the table and pointed to our approximate location, and then traced a route south and west, across the border into Idaho, down through a series of small towns toward the Snake River Plain, and then west toward Boise. Boise, she said, had an airport. Boise was large enough to have international connections, or at least connections to a coastal city that had international connections. The distance was roughly 500 kilometers. We had 3/4 of a tank of gas, which, in the rental sedan, would cover maybe 400 kilometers on paved roads, less on gravel. The math, if you could call it that, was tight, but not impossible. I did not want to leave. The cabin was safe. The supplies in the underground shelter could sustain 2 people for weeks, maybe longer. The road outside was quiet. Nothing had come up the track. Nothing had approached the gate. Staying felt rational. Staying felt like what you do when the world outside is breaking, and the space you are in is not yet broken. Elke looked at me across the table, with an expression I was beginning to know. patient but unmovable. She said that the cabin was not an airport. She said that the supplies would last, and the fuel would last, and the water would last, but none of those things would get us home. She said that every day we stayed was a day the roads got worse, and the fuel got scarcer, and the distance between us and any functioning departure point grew wider. She said staying was not safety. Staying was the slow version of being trapped. She was right. I knew she was right while she was saying it, and I also knew that knowing she was right was not the same as being willing to act on it. The cabin had become something more than a shelter in 3 days. It had become the boundary between a world I could manage and a world I could not. And crossing back out through that boundary required a kind of courage I was not sure I had. We packed the car with everything we could carry: canned food, water bottles, the medical bin, the wool blankets, the hand crank radio, the flashlights. Elke took the pocket knife, and I took a hatchet from the woodpile. We closed the cabin, shut the shutters, locked the front door using a key we found on a nail inside the pantry. Elke wrote a note on the back of a grocery receipt and left it on the kitchen table. It said, in English, "2 travelers sheltered here September 14th to 15th. We took supplies. Thank you. We hope to repay you." The road out was the same as the road in. Gravel, washboard, empty. At the gate I got out and squeezed through the gap to unlock the car we had left hidden in the brush. It started on the first try. Elke drove. She was a better driver than I was on these roads. More decisive with the wheel. More willing to accelerate through rough sections rather than creeping over them the way I did. We reached the paved road and turned south, and the mountains opened up ahead of us, and the sky was blue and wide, and for a few kilometers I let myself believe that the worst was behind us. The first town we came to was Lima, Montana, a small cluster of buildings along I-15. Population maybe 200 in normal times. When we arrived around midday on September 15th, the town was partially evacuated. The gas station was closed, pumps locked, a handwritten cardboard sign in the window saying, "No fuel." The diner next door was open, but nearly empty. Inside, a woman in her 60s was serving coffee to 3 men in ranch clothes who sat at the counter with their hats on and rifles leaning against the counter beside their stools. One of them looked at us when we came in, and his expression was not hostile, but it was not welcoming. It was the expression of a man evaluating whether you were a problem or a resource. Elke ordered coffee, and I ordered coffee and a sandwich, and the woman behind the counter served us without conversation. The television above the counter was tuned to a Bozeman station, but the broadcast was a static test pattern with a scrolling text bar at the bottom that said, "Emergency Broadcast System. Stand by." One of the men at the counter, the oldest, with a weathered face and hands like leather gloves, asked where we were coming from. Elke said the Centennial Valley. He nodded slowly and said the highway south was open as far as DuBois, Idaho, but that he had heard from a friend on a CB radio that the road was blocked somewhere between DuBois and Idaho Falls by what he called a situation. He did not specify what kind of situation. Elke asked if there was fuel anywhere in town, and he said Hank Purcell at the farm co-op might sell us some from his private tank if we had cash. He said the card machines were down and had been since yesterday. We found Hank Purcell at the co-op, a corrugated metal building at the south end of town with a loading dock and a row of agricultural equipment parked along the fence. He was a large man, maybe 50, with a calm manner and eyes that looked at you with the same assessing quality as the rancher in the diner. He sold us 20 gallons of gasoline from a 1,000-gallon tank behind the building at a price roughly 3 times the normal rate, in cash. While he filled our container, he said, conversationally, that he had spoken to his sister in Boise that morning, and she said the airport was closed and the city was under a curfew, and the National Guard was running the checkpoints at every highway entrance. He said his sister was a reliable woman who did not exaggerate. He said we might want to think about where exactly we were trying to get to. Elka thanked him and paid him, and we poured the gasoline into the rental car's tank and sat in the car in the co-op parking lot for a few minutes in silence. Boise was gone as an option. The plan that had gotten us out of the cabin that morning was already dead, less than 4 hours old. Elka unfolded the map again and studied it, and I watched her eyes move across the paper, and I could see her constructing and discarding routes the way she would construct and discard treatment approaches for a difficult patient, systematically, without sentiment. She said Portland. She said if we went south into Idaho and then cut west across the high desert to Oregon, we could reach Portland in maybe 18 hours of driving. Portland was on the coast. Portland had an international airport and a seaport. If the airport was closed, maybe the seaport was not. If the seaport was closed, maybe the Canadian border was reachable from there. She said the key was to move west, away from the center of the country, toward the edges, toward the water, toward places that had connections outward. I said, and if Portland is the same as Boise? Elke folded the map. Then we go to the Canadian border, and we cross it on foot if we have to, and we find a flight from Vancouver. But we keep moving west. We do not go backward. We do not go east. We do not stay. There was something in her voice during those days that I have thought about often since. A clarity that went beyond logic. She was not smarter than me, not tougher, not braver. But she had a quality that I lacked, which was the ability to accept a new reality completely and immediately, without spending time grieving the old one. When the cabin stopped being the answer, she did not mourn the cabin. When Boise stopped being the answer, she did not mourn Boise. She moved to the next possibility, the way water moves around a stone, without resentment, without argument with the obstacle itself. I was slower. I kept looking back. I kept wanting the previous plan to still be valid. This difference between us was, I think, the thing that kept us alive, and it was also the thing that led to the worst decision I made. South of Lima, the highway crossed into Idaho, and the landscape changed from mountain valley to high desert, open and tan and flat, sage and lava rock under an enormous sky. We drove for 2 hours without seeing another car. The road was empty in both directions. No trucks, no police, no military vehicles, nothing. Just the road and the sage and the mountains on the horizon, like a wall around the edge of the visible world. The silence on the radio was nearly total now. Elke cranked the handheld unit every 30 minutes and scanned the bands and found only the emergency broadcast, which had stopped updating and was playing a version from the previous day. And occasional bursts of CB radio chatter, fragmented, voices talking over each other about road conditions and locations I could not identify. Outside Dubois, Idaho, we found the situation the rancher in Lima had mentioned. A line of vehicles, maybe 40 cars and trucks, stopped on the highway. Not a roadblock this time. The road ahead was simply full of abandoned vehicles. Some pulled over, some stopped in the travel lanes, doors open, engines off. A tractor-trailer was jackknifed across both lanes, about 100 meters ahead of the last occupied car, completely blocking passage. People were standing outside their cars, looking at the jackknifed truck, and talking to each other, and a few were walking back toward Dubois on foot. Elke got out and talked to a woman in a Subaru with Idaho plates, who was loading a suitcase into a backpack frame. The woman said she had been sitting here since dawn, that the truck driver was gone, that people had tried to move the truck, but the cab was locked and the air brakes were set, and no one had the tools or the knowledge to release them. She said some people had driven off-road around the blockage, but the terrain was rough, and 2 vehicles had gotten stuck in the soft sand and were now part of the obstacle. She said she was walking back to Dubois because her sister lived there, and she was done trying to go south. She said this with the exhausted finality of someone who has been making decisions all day and has no more decisions left. Elke came back to the car and said we needed to go off-road. Not around the truck, the terrain there was proven bad, but backward, back north a few kilometers to a dirt ranch road she had seen on the right side of the highway, heading west. She said if we could get west far enough, we could connect with Highway 93, which ran south to Twin Falls, and from there, Interstate 84 west toward Boise and Portland. It was a longer route, and it went through empty country. But the alternative was sitting on this highway until our gas ran out, or something worse found us. The ranch road was not a road. It was a pair of tire tracks through the sage, rutted and rocky, barely wide enough for the sedan. We drove for maybe an hour, very slowly, the car bouncing and scraping, both of us silent, watching the track ahead for rocks or washouts. The sun was getting low. The mountains to the west were turning purple. Twice the road forked, and Elke chose based on the map, which showed the area as blank space between 2 labeled highways, a gap in the cartographic record that we were driving through on faith. Near sunset we came to a ranch. A gate, a cattle guard, a gravel drive leading to a cluster of buildings, house, barn, corral, windmill. The house had lights on. An American flag hung from a pole near the porch. A dog barked from behind the barn. Elke said we should stop and ask for directions, and I agreed because we were nearly out of track, and the map showed nothing between us and the highway except more blank space. The rancher was a woman named Constance de la Cerda, mid-50s, brown skin, dark hair going gray, wearing work jeans and a flannel shirt. She came out onto the porch when she heard the car and stood there with one hand on the railing and the other holding a walkie-talkie, watching us park and get out. The dog, a blue heeler, came around the barn and stood between her and us, not growling, but alert. Elke raised both hands, palms out, and said in her clear, accented English that we were travelers, that we were lost, that we needed directions to Highway 93. Constance looked at us for a long moment. Then she looked at the car, at our license plate, which was a Montana rental tag, at our backpacks visible through the rear window. She said, "Where are you from?" And Elke said, "Austria," and I said, "the Czech Republic." And Constance raised her eyebrows slightly and said, "Long way from home." She invited us inside. Her house was warm and orderly and smelled like wood smoke and cooked beans. She lived alone. Her husband had died 4 years ago, and her son was in the army, stationed in Georgia, and she had not heard from him in 3 days. She told us this while she heated beans and cornbread and poured coffee. And she told it without self-pity, as a series of facts that described her situation the way a topographic map describes terrain, objectively, with the emotions implied by the contours rather than stated in the legend. She had been following events on a battery-powered shortwave radio, and she knew more than we did. She knew that the infection, as she called it, was not confined to the South. She knew that it had appeared in Montana and Idaho and Washington State. She knew that Portland was under martial law and that the airport was closed. She knew that the Canadian border was closed in both directions. Elke listened to all of this with her coffee cup held in both hands, perfectly still. When Constance finished, Elke asked one question. "Is there any way out of this country by air or sea that you know of?" Constance considered this. She said she had heard on the shortwave from a man in eastern Oregon who ran an amateur radio network that there were international flights still operating out of San Francisco on a limited schedule, military-escorted, embassy coordinated, for foreign nationals with valid passports. She said she had no way to verify this. She said San Francisco was a very long way from where we were sitting. Elka put her coffee cup down and looked at me, and I could see the route forming in her mind before she spoke it. West across Idaho to Highway 93, south to Twin Falls, west on I-84 to Boise, south on secondary roads to avoid the city, then southwest through Nevada to California, then San Francisco. 1,200 kilometers, maybe more. 3 days of driving if the roads were open, a week or more if they were not. With fuel that we could not guarantee finding, and conditions that were deteriorating by the hour, and a destination based on unverified second-hand information from an amateur radio operator in eastern Oregon. She looked at me and she said, "We can stay here and be safe for a while, or we can try." Constance said we could stay the night either way. She put fresh sheets on the guest bed and gave us towels and showed us the bathroom, and she said that in the morning she could give us 10 gallons of diesel from her farm tank, which would not work in our gasoline sedan. But she also had a truck, a 1997 Ford F-250 diesel, that she could not use because the transmission had been slipping for months and she had not been able to get it repaired. She said if we could fix the transmission or drive it gently enough, we could take it. She said she was not leaving the ranch. She said this was her land and her husband's land, and she would stay. That night in the guest bedroom, lying on clean sheets in a dark house while a stranger's dog slept on the floor in the hallway, Elka and I had the only argument of the trip. It was quiet, conducted in whispers, and it was about whether we should stay. Elka wanted to leave in the morning. She said every day was a narrowing window. She said Constance's information about San Francisco might be wrong, but it was the only lead we had, and leads do not last, and windows do not stay open while you deliberate. She said she needed to get home. She said her mother was in Graz, and her mother was alone, and her mother would be terrified by now. I wanted to stay. The ranch was secure, provisioned, defensible. Constance was competent and knowledgeable and willing to have us. The underground shelter at the hunting cabin had shown me what prepared people could build in this country. And Constance's ranch was that same principle operating at full scale. Water from the windmill, food from the pantry and the garden and the livestock, walls between us and whatever was outside. I argued for waiting, for letting things stabilize, for gathering more information before committing to a 1,200-kilometer drive through a country that was coming apart. Elka said, very quietly, "Lucas, there is no stabilization coming. You understand that, yes? This does not get better and then we leave. We leave or we live here forever. Those are the options." In the morning, we took the truck. Constance showed me how to baby the transmission, keeping the RPMs low, shifting gently, avoiding steep grades where possible. The truck was heavy and slow and loud, and it smelled like hay and diesel and dog. Constance filled the tank and put 2 extra 5-gallon cans of diesel in the bed. She gave us a cooler with sandwiches and apples and hard-boiled eggs and a gallon jug of water. She gave Elka a road atlas of Idaho and Nevada that she said was from 2014, but the roads had not changed much. She did not give us the rifle I had seen mounted on the wall behind her front door, and I did not ask for it. At the gate, Elka got out and hugged Constance, and Constance held her for a moment longer than politeness required. And then she let go and stepped back and looked at both of us and said, "Go straight. Don't stop for anything you don't have to. If somebody puts something in the road to make you stop, go around it or go through it." Her face as she said this was steady and unsentimental, and I understood that she had already decided this was the last time she would see us, and she had accepted it the way she had accepted her husband's death and her son's silence. as a contour on the map of her life that she could not alter and would not waste energy mourning. Highway 93 South was open. We drove through the morning with the windows up and the heater on because the altitude was high and the air was cold and the truck's cab was drafty. The road ran through a long valley between mountain ranges, and the scenery was spectacular, and I barely saw it. Elka navigated. Small towns, Chalice, Mackay, Arco, appeared and receded. Some showed signs of life, vehicles parked outside stores, a generator humming behind a building, a face in a window. Others were silent in a way that felt intentional, curtains drawn, streets empty, the stillness not of absence but of hiding. South of Arco, the road joined Highway 20 and ran west through the high lava desert. This was the emptiest landscape I had ever seen, flatter and more barren than anything in Central Europe. Miles of black volcanic rock and sparse vegetation under a sky so wide it felt like standing inside a bowl. The truck ran steadily. The transmission slipped once, crossing a rise, and I eased off the gas and let the RPMs drop, and it caught again. Elka watched me do this without comment, learning the truck's behavior through observation, the way she learned everything, by paying attention. Somewhere west of Craters of the Moon, we began to see vehicles on the road again. Not traffic exactly, but scattered cars and trucks, some moving, some stopped, some clearly abandoned with doors open and contents scattered on the pavement. A van on the shoulder had its back doors open, and suitcases were strewn across the road as if someone had been sorting through them in a hurry. A sedan in the oncoming lane had been driven into the ditch, and the windshield was cracked in a spiderweb pattern. And there was a dark shape in the driver's seat that I did not look at carefully. Elke looked. Elke always looked. Near the junction with I-84, the road became congested and then impassable. Vehicles backed up for at least a kilometer, honking, engines running, a few people out of their cars shouting at each other. Military vehicles were visible at the head of the line, Humvees and a troop transport, and soldiers were standing in the road in full gear directing traffic, which is to say, forcing it to stop. Elke said to turn around. She said it immediately, without waiting to see what the checkpoint wanted, without curiosity. She said, "They will take the truck, or they will detain us, or they will send us somewhere we do not want to go. Turn around." I turned around. We backtracked east for 15 minutes, and then Elke found a county road heading south toward the Snake River. The road was paved, narrow, and empty, and it wound through irrigated farmland that was green and lush and absolutely silent. No tractors, no workers, no movement at all, except sprinklers running on automatic timers over fields of potatoes and sugar beets. Water arcing in the empty air, like the machinery did not know that the people who programmed it were gone. South of the Snake River, the country changed again, getting drier, rising into sage-covered plateaus. We were in Nevada by late afternoon, heading south on a highway Elke had found in the atlas, a 2-lane road through country so empty that the map showed no towns at all for 150 kilometers. The fuel gauge was falling. We had used one of the spare cans already. The truck was getting maybe 12 kilometers per gallon, worse on grades, and Nevada was nothing but grades. Long, slow climbs, followed by long, slow descents through basins and ranges. Basins and ranges. The same pattern repeating to the horizon. Elke was quiet for long stretches during the Nevada portion of the drive. She sat with the atlas open on her lap and looked out the window and occasionally made a notation on the map's margin with a pen. Distances, fuel calculations, estimated arrival times. She was building a model of our situation the way an engineer builds a model of a bridge, testing load points, looking for where the stress would concentrate. That night we pulled off the highway onto a dirt road that led to an abandoned mining claim, a rusted equipment shed, and a collapsed wooden structure, and a flat area of packed earth where we parked the truck and ate sandwiches from Constance's cooler, and drank water, and did not light a fire, because Elka said fire attracted attention, and in open desert, attention could come from any direction. We slept in the truck cab, front and back seats, awkwardly, cold despite the blankets from the cabin. Elka's breathing was even and controlled, and I lay there in the dark and listened to it, and to the silence of the desert, and to the wind rocking the truck gently on its springs. And I thought about Brno, and my apartment, and my desk with the computer, and the coffee cup I had left unwashed in the sink before flying to Salt Lake City, which was 9 days ago, and an entire world away. In the morning, the radio brought only static. Not even the emergency broadcast, just white noise across every band, AM and FM and shortwave, as if the entire electromagnetic spectrum had been emptied overnight. Elka cranked the handle and scanned methodically for 15 minutes and found nothing, and put the radio down and said, "Let's go." We drove south through Nevada for 2 days. The fuel arithmetic dictated everything. We had enough diesel for roughly 400 kilometers, and San Francisco was at least 600 kilometers away, which meant we needed to find fuel somewhere in Nevada. And Nevada, in the best of times, was a state where towns were scarce and gas stations were far apart. And now it was a state where most of those stations were closed, or empty, or burned. Outside a town called Winnemucca, we found fuel. A truck stop on the interstate, partially looted, windows broken, shelves ransacked. But the underground diesel tanks still had product, and the manual pump levers still worked. Elka figured out the mechanism while I kept watch, which meant standing at the edge of the parking lot, staring at the empty highway, and the empty town, and the empty sky, and seeing nothing at all. She filled the truck's tank and both spare cans, and we left without going inside the convenience store, because the front door was open, and there were flies, dense and loud. And the sound of those flies said everything about what was inside that we did not need to see. Between Winnemucca and Reno, the highway was intermittently blocked. Sometimes it was vehicles, sometimes it was debris. Once it was a section of overpass that had collapsed, though whether from an accident or a deliberate demolition, we could not tell. Each time Elka navigated around the obstacle, sometimes on frontage roads, sometimes on dirt tracks, sometimes driving through open desert with the atlas on her lap and the compass on the dashboard, and nothing between us and the next ridge except sage and dust and the tire tracks we were leaving behind us. Near Reno, we saw people for the first time in almost 2 days. A group of maybe 20 walking along the interstate shoulder, carrying bags and backpacks and pushing shopping carts. They were moving east, away from Reno, and when they saw the truck approaching, some of them stopped and waved, and a few stepped into the road. Elka said to slow down, but not to stop. She said to look at their faces as we passed. Their faces were scared and tired and human, and none of them were wrong. None of them were displaying the behavior that the emergency broadcasts had warned about. They were just people, walking away from a city with whatever they could carry. Elka said to keep driving, and I kept driving, and the group shrank in the mirror, and I watched them until they disappeared. And neither of us spoke about the decision to pass them, because the decision had been automatic and mutual, and neither of us was proud of it. Reno itself was a ruin. We skirted the city to the south on back roads, and even at that distance we could see the fires, multiple columns of smoke rising from different neighborhoods, and hear the sirens, not emergency sirens, but car alarms and burglar alarms, and the sustained electronic wail of systems that had been triggered and that nobody was coming to silence. On the southern bypass road, we passed a strip mall where every window was broken, and the parking lot was full of scattered debris, and a single figure was standing in the middle of the lot, motionless, facing away from us, wearing what appeared to be a hospital gown. Elka watched the figure as we passed. It did not move. It did not turn its head. It stood perfectly still, with its arms at its sides and its bare feet on the asphalt. And something about its stillness was worse than movement would have been. West of Reno, the road climbed into the Sierra Nevada, and the air got cold, and the landscape shifted from desert to pine forest, and the road twisted through mountain passes that the heavy truck took slowly in second gear, the transmission whining. On the western side of Donner Pass, and the historical irony of that name was not lost on either of us, the road descended into California, and the pine forest gave way to oak woodland, and the oak woodland gave way to dry grass hills, and in the distance, beyond the hills, we could see the haze of the Central Valley, and beyond that, nothing. Because San Francisco was still 3 hours away, and we could not see it yet. But we could feel it pulling us forward the way a destination pulls you when you have bet everything on reaching it. But the descent into California was also where the situation on the road changed. The highways were more congested here, more blocked, more dangerous. We passed overturned vehicles and burned vehicles, and vehicles with bullet holes in their doors. We passed roadblocks that had been erected and then abandoned and then partially dismantled. We passed a school bus on its side in a ditch with the emergency exit open and no one visible anywhere near it. The scale of the collapse was larger here because the population was larger, and the density of evidence was correspondingly thicker. And driving through it felt like reading a story written in debris, each scene implying the one that had preceded it. South of Sacramento, on a 2-lane road through the farmland of the Central Valley, we ran into a group of 3 men standing in the road beside a pickup truck parked across both lanes. One of them was holding a hunting rifle. Elka said, "Do not stop." And I did not stop. I drove onto the shoulder and around the pickup truck at speed, the Ford bouncing over a drainage ditch and back onto the road. And in the mirror, I saw the men watching us go without raising the rifle, without chasing, just watching. 3 men in a road, deciding whether we were worth pursuing. Elka's hands were gripping the edge of her seat, and her knuckles were white, and she did not let go until we were around the next curve and out of sight. That was the moment, I think, when the trip stopped being an escape and became something else. An endurance test. A negotiation between what we needed and what the road would permit. Every kilometer forward required a decision. This route or that one. This risk or that one. This stranger approached or avoided. Elka made most of those decisions, and I followed them because she was almost always right. And because the times she was wrong, she corrected quickly, without defensiveness, pivoting to the next option before the consequences of the previous one could solidify. We reached the Bay Area on September 18th, 4 days after leaving the cabin, 3 days after leaving Constance's ranch. The eastern approach to San Francisco through the East Bay cities was impassable. Traffic, military checkpoints, fires visible on the Oakland hills. Elke directed us south, around the bottom of the bay, through a tangle of suburban roads and freeway interchanges that she navigated from the atlas with steady calm, while I drove and the truck shuddered and the transmission slipped on every stop and start. South of San Jose, we found a road that led north toward the coast, and in the late afternoon light, we came over a ridge and saw the Pacific Ocean for the first time. Gray and enormous and flat and reaching to the edge of everything. Elke looked at it, and I looked at it, and neither of us said anything, but the effect of that water, that borderless expanse after days of roads and mountains and desert and fear, was like a physical weight lifting. The ocean meant edges. The ocean meant boats. The ocean meant a direction that was not blocked by checkpoints or debris or fire. The coast road north toward San Francisco was partially open. We drove through small towns that were evacuated, shuttered, silent. Half Moon Bay, Pacifica, Daly City. The names were exotic to me, American in a way that seemed both specific and fantastical. Names from a world that was still organized enough to have named its suburbs. At the edge of San Francisco proper, we ran into a checkpoint. But this one was different from the others. It was staffed by uniformed personnel, not soldiers, but some kind of federal agency. And there were buses lined up behind the checkpoint, and a large tent with tables and chairs and people sitting in them filling out paperwork. Elka said, "This is it. This is the embassy evacuation." She was out of the truck before I had finished parking. She walked directly to the nearest uniformed person and spoke to him, and he pointed her toward the tent. She walked to the tent and found the table with a small European Union flag on a plastic stand next to a printed sign that said, EU Nationals, Consular Assistance. And she sat down and took out her Austrian passport and began talking to the woman behind the table. I followed her. The woman behind the table looked at my Czech passport and typed something into a laptop and made a phone call, and then told me that Czech citizens were being processed through a separate list coordinated with the Czech embassy in Washington, which was operating remotely from an undisclosed location. She said my name would be added to the list and that a flight would be arranged, but she could not guarantee when. She said it might be days. She said the flights were going to Frankfurt, and from Frankfurt, EU nationals were being distributed to their home countries by rail and bus. She said the process was underway and functioning, but the volume was high and the priority list was long, and some nationalities had larger backlogs than others. Elka's Austrian processing was faster. Austria had a dedicated consular officer on site, a young man from Vienna with glasses and a clipboard, who checked her passport and cross-referenced a list, and told her there was a seat on a flight leaving from San Francisco International at 0600 the next morning, military escorted, direct to Frankfurt. He said she needed to be at the assembly point, which was the tent we were standing in, by 0300. He stamped her passport and gave her a printed boarding authorization, and she held it in both hands and looked at it, and I could see her breathing change, her shoulders dropping, the tension of the last 5 days releasing from her body in a single long exhale. Then she looked at me. The next 3 hours were the hardest of the trip, and they had nothing to do with the infected, or the roads, or the checkpoints. They were hard because Elka had a seat on a plane and I did not. And the question of what to do about that was not a question that could be solved by navigation or endurance or clever routing on a map. We sat in the truck in the parking lot outside the evacuation tent as the sun went down over the Pacific and the fog rolled in through the Golden Gate, which we could see from where we were parked. That red bridge emerging from the gray mist like something painted by a dreamer who did not believe in subtlety. Elka said I should come with her. She said I should go to the Austrian consular table and tell them I was her partner, her fiancé, whatever was necessary, and ask to be added to the Austrian flight. She said the rules were flexible in emergencies, and the consular officer was young and sympathetic, and she thought it could work. I said I could not do that, and this is the part that has stayed with me, the part that I began this account with, the decision that I replay. It was not morality. It was not honesty or principle or any of the noble-sounding things you could put in its place. It was something smaller and stupider. It was the simple mechanical fact that my Czech passport had already been entered into a system by the EU consular table, flagged for Czech processing, and I did not know what would happen if I tried to override that system by appearing at the Austrian table with a different story. In the Czech Republic, we have a particular relationship with bureaucratic systems. We respect them and fear them in roughly equal measure, because we have historical memory of what happens when systems decide you are a problem. You do not game the system. You do not test the system. You wait for the system to process you, because the alternative is the system processing you in a way you did not choose. Elka listened to this, and she did not argue. She sat in the passenger seat with her boarding authorization in her lap, and the fog thickening outside the windows, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I will stay with you. I will give up the seat. We will both wait for the checklist." This was the moment. This was where the story turns, and where I have to be steady in the telling, because the temptation is to make myself better than I was. Elka offered to stay, and I wanted her to stay. The relief I felt when she said those words was physical, immediate. A warmth in my chest like stepping inside from cold rain. She would stay. We would be together. The 5 days we had spent together had built something between us that was not romance, not exactly, but was the particular bond of two people who have navigated a collapsing world by relying on each other's judgment. And the thought of losing that bond, of standing alone in a parking lot in a foreign city with a foreign passport and no plan, was more frightening than anything the road had shown me. But I also understood, in the same moment, what her staying meant. Her seat would go to someone else. Her processing was complete. Her flight was confirmed. Her path home was open. My processing had not even begun. The checklist might take days. It might take weeks. It might never produce a flight at all. If she stayed with me, she was trading certainty for uncertainty. Trading a guaranteed departure for the possibility that we might both end up stranded. She was offering to do this because of 5 days of shared driving and shared fear and shared canned soup in a cabin in the mountains. And the math of that trade was not in her favor, and she knew it, and she was offering anyway. I told her to go. She argued. She argued quietly and fiercely and with a precision that I recognized from every navigation decision she had made on the road, marshaling evidence, anticipating counter-arguments, presenting her case. She said the check flight would come. She said we would go together. She said she had not driven 1,400 kilometers to abandon someone in a parking lot. I said she was not abandoning me. I said she was going home to her mother in Graz, which was what she had told me she needed to do, which was the reason we had left the cabin, and the reason we had driven through 2 states and crossed a desert and skirted a burning city. I said her mother was waiting, and her seat was confirmed, and the fog was getting thicker, and the flight was at 6 in the morning, and she needed to sleep before then. We sat in the truck, and the fog erased the Golden Gate Bridge, and the parking lot lights came on, and the tent glowed yellow in the mist, and people moved back and forth between the tent and the buses, and the whole scene had the quality of a transit camp in a war documentary, orderly and desperate simultaneously. Elka reached across the seat and took my hand and held it. Her hand was dry and warm and calloused from the steering wheel and the hatchet and the 5 days of gripping things to stay upright in a tipping world. She held my hand and looked at me, and I could see her making the decision, accepting it, letting go of the argument the way she let go of every plan that no longer worked, cleanly, without residual negotiation. She said, "You call me when you land, from any phone, from anywhere. You call me." She wrote her mother's landline number in Graz on the back of the gas station receipt, the same receipt she had used to write the thank you note in the cabin. She wrote it carefully, each digit clear. She folded the receipt and put it in my shirt pocket and buttoned the pocket. Then she took her backpack from behind the seat and her passport from her jacket and the boarding authorization from her lap. She opened the truck door and the fog came in, cold and wet, carrying the salt smell of the Pacific. At the edge of the parking lot, she turned and looked back. The fog was thick enough that I could only see her outline, a shape with a backpack, one hand raised. She held the hand up for a moment, and then she walked into the tent and the fog closed behind her. The next 4 days in San Francisco were the longest of my life. The evacuation processing center operated from the tent and from a requisitioned hotel ballroom near the airport. EU nationals were sorted by country, then by registration time, then by flight availability. The Czech consular presence was a single woman named Radka Sladkova, who worked 18-hour days from a folding table with a laptop, a satellite phone, and a box of protein bars, and who processed Czech nationals with the grim efficiency of someone who understood that bureaucracy was the only tool she had, and she would use it until it broke. On the second day, Radka told me there was a flight, not to Frankfurt, but to London, and from London, a connection to Prague arranged by the Czech Foreign Ministry. The flight was in 2 days. She told me to stay close to the processing center and to check in every 6 hours. She told me, not unkindly, that if I missed the check-in window, my name would move to the bottom of the list and there might not be another flight. Those 2 days in the hotel ballroom were surreal. Dozens of Europeans from a dozen countries sitting in folding chairs, eating military ration packages, charging phones from a generator-powered strip, exchanging fragments of news in English and French and German and languages I could not identify. A Norwegian man had driven from Texas. A French couple had walked from Denver to Salt Lake City. A group of Italian students had been on a bus tour of the Southwest and had spent 3 days in a Walmart in Flagstaff before the National Guard evacuated them. Everyone had a story, and every story followed the same arc. Ordinary travel disrupted by incomprehensible violence, confusion, misdirection, fear, and then this tent, this ballroom, this fragile pipeline back to a continent that was, from the fragments of news we could gather, still more or less functioning. On the night before my flight, I found a working phone, a landline in the hotel's back office that had been made available for evacuees, and I called the number Elka had written on the receipt. It rang 4 times, and then a woman's voice answered in German, and I said, in my stiff, Czech-accented German, "This is Lucas, Elka's friend, from the road." There was a pause, and then the woman, Elka's mother, said in careful English, "She is here. She arrived yesterday. She is sleeping now. She told me about you. She told me to thank you if you called." Another pause. Then, "She told me you made her go." I said, "She made herself go. She makes all the decisions. I only drove." Elka's mother laughed. A short, startled, genuine laugh. She said she would tell Elka I called. She said I should call again when I landed in Prague. She said, "Thank you for bringing her to the airport," which was such an ordinary thing to say, such a normal mother's gratitude, that I had to put the phone down and sit in the hotel office chair for a while with my hands on my knees, breathing. The flight from San Francisco was a chartered Airbus, half full, operated by a British carrier under military escort. 2 fighter jets accompanied us to cruising altitude and then peeled away, and we flew over the Pacific and the polar route, and 12 hours later descended through cloud cover into Heathrow, which was operating but altered. Security checkpoints doubled, military vehicles on the tarmac. A hushed efficiency that suggested the airport was functioning through sheer institutional will rather than normal conditions. From Heathrow, a Czech government bus took me and 11 other Czech nationals to a military airfield, where a small transport plane flew us to Prague. The whole process took 31 hours from San Francisco to Václav Havel Airport. And when I stepped onto the tarmac in Prague, the air was cold and smelled like rain and diesel and autumn leaves. And a woman from the Foreign Ministry handed me a bottle of water and a printed sheet with phone numbers for psychological support services. and I stood there on the tarmac holding the water and the paper and feeling the rain on my face and understanding that I was home and that home still existed and that both of those facts were astonishing. I called Elke from my apartment in Brno that evening. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was clear and strong and slightly hoarse, the way it had been every morning in the truck when she woke up from sleeping in the cab. She said, "You made it." Not a question, a confirmation, a completed circuit. We talked for an hour. She told me about the flight from San Francisco to Frankfurt, which had been turbulent and silent. Nobody talking, everyone looking out the windows at the ocean. She told me about her mother at the Frankfurt arrivals gate, holding a sign with Elke's name on it, even though there was no one else she could have been there to meet. She told me about sleeping for 14 hours in her childhood bedroom in Graz, and waking up and not knowing where she was, and reaching for the gear shift of a truck that was not there. I told her about the ballroom, and Radka Sladkova, and the flight to London, and the rain in Prague. I did not tell her about the 2 nights in the San Francisco parking lot, sleeping in Constance's truck, alone, with the fog so thick that the truck windows were opaque, and every sound was muffled and distorted, and I lay there listening for footsteps, or worse, and hearing only the foghorns on the bay, low and mournful and steady, the sound of a coast warning ships away from rocks. At the end of the call, Elke said, "I still have the map, the Montana gas station map. It's on my desk." I said, "I still have the receipt with your mother's number. It's in my shirt pocket." There was a pause. The kind of pause that happens when 2 people have shared something that exceeds the vocabulary available to them. Then Elke said, "Okay, good. Don't lose it." That was 8 months ago. The situation in the United States has continued to evolve in ways that European media covers with the detached horror of a continent watching a familiar ally become an unfamiliar landscape. Some American cities are functioning. Some are not. The international evacuation flights continued for 2 months after mine, and then stopped. And now the information that comes out of North America comes through military channels, and amateur radio, and satellite imagery, and none of it is complete. Elke and I talk every week, sometimes twice. She finished her clinical placement in Graz and is working now at a rehabilitation center. Her voice on the phone is the same voice that told me to get off the interstate, that said we should take the frontage road, that said staying was the slow version of being trapped. Steady, unsentimental, right. When people ask me about the trip, and they do ask, often, because a Czech graphic designer who drove 1,400 kilometers across the American West during the outbreak is apparently a notable enough story for dinner parties. I tell them about the roads, and the mountains, and the empty towns, and the fog in San Francisco. I tell them about Constance de la Cerda, and her dog, and her diesel truck. I tell them about the gas station in Winnemucca, and the flies. I tell them about the geysers in Yellowstone, which feels like it happened in a different lifetime to a different person. But the thing I think about, the thing I circle back to, is not the landscape or the danger or the silence on the radio. It is the parking lot in San Francisco, and the fog, and Elke's hand on mine, and the decision I made to tell her to go. Because that decision was right. Unambiguously, arithmetically, practically right. She had a seat, and I did not. And she needed to take it, and she took it. And she is home and safe and working. The right decision. And yet, the receipt is still in my shirt pocket. Not the same shirt. I have washed that shirt many times since September. But I transferred the receipt to each clean shirt, pocket to pocket, morning after morning. A small folded piece of paper with a phone number I know by heart, but cannot bring myself to discard. It is not a memento. It is not sentimentality. It is the physical form of a question I have not finished answering, which is whether telling someone to leave you is an act of generosity or an act of fear. Whether I sent Elka home because it was best for her, or because watching her walk into the fog was easier than asking her to stay in the dark with me. The pocket is buttoned. The receipt is inside. Elka calls on Thursdays. The line connects, clear and steady, Brno to Graz, and her voice comes through. And outside the window, Brno is cold and gray and ordinary and whole. And the coffee cup I left unwashed in the sink before I flew to Salt Lake City is clean now and back in the cupboard. And the world is the world. And the distance between what happened and what I carry is exactly the size of a folded receipt in a shirt pocket, which is to say, small enough to forget, if I ever decide to. I have not decided to.